today's Old Testament simultaneous session. I am Gilberto Ruiz, and it is my pleasure this morning to introduce our presenter, Timothy Sandoval. Timothy J. Sandoval joined the Religion Department of Texas Christian University, ETU, in the fall of 2024. He has previously taught at Bright Divinity School and Chicago Theological Seminary. Sandoval's scholarly work is focused on the Bible's wisdom literature, especially the book of Proverbs, as well as aspects of Latinx biblical interpretation. Born and raised in the Bay Area, just south of San Francisco, Sandoval completed his undergraduate studies in history with a minor in religious studies at the University of California, Davis. He earned his MDiv degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and a PhD in Hebrew Bible at Emory University. Sandoval is the author of The Discourse of Wealth and Poverty in the Book of Proverbs, Money and the Way of Wisdom, and The Moral Vision of Proverbs, a virtue-oriented approach to wisdom. He is also co-editor of 5 other books and various articles and book chapters. He continues to work on Proverbs, but is currently preparing a monograph on the Book of Tobit. The title of his paper today is The Virtue Ethics of Proverbs and the Poem to the Woman of Valor. We look forward to hearing his reflections and poems. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Gilberto, and thank you all for being here. It's certainly an honor to be here to talk with you a little bit this morning. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Over the last 25 years or so, a number of scholars have turned to virtue ethics as a lens by which to read and understand the moral theological contours of the Hebrew Bible, especially what's still commonly called the wisdom literature, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, certain Psalms. William P. Brown's 1996 book, Character in Crisis, A Fresh Approach to the Wisdom Literature of the Old Testament, might be said to have inaugurated this turn to virtue ethics. Others, too, of course, have drawn on virtue ethics to greater and lesser extents in their analysis of biblical texts, especially Proverbs, as the images on the slides make clear. Now, often folks undertake this work, in part at least, to demonstrate that Proverbs' moral vision isn't as simplistic as it's sometimes thought. Now, in this work, biblicists have learned not only from the work of scholars of the ancient world, the work of contemporary philosophers and moral theologians have been instrumental as well. Perhaps the most influential of these thinkers for biblical scholars have been Martha Nussbaum and Alistair MacIntyre, who each strive to elaborate the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics for the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Today, of course, I can't offer full arguments as to how Proverbs can be well read in terms of virtue ethics. Instead, I'll first sketch some main contours of virtue ethics, not to claim that Proverbs constitutes some sort of Hebrew synopsis of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. It does not. But to intimate that the book's resonances with concerns of virtue traditions warrants understanding the work as what I call a virtue-oriented moral discourse, that like other moral traditions, other ancient moral traditions especially, is tethered quite fully to ancient patriarchal maleness. Subsequently, I'll suggest that the Eshet poem in Proverbs 31 and to 31 represents a site where the book's tight connection of wisdom and virtue with maleness is, or is potentially, undermined, but also reasserted via the poem's deployment of the rhetoric of a socially prized or hegemonic masculinity. I suggest, too, that the possible social dynamics that generated the text can helpfully be explored by using Frederick Jameson's conception of the political unconscious. Finally, I offer a few words about how a virtue-oriented moral tradition, like Proverbs, might be critically and constructively engaged today. Now, when thinking about Proverbs and virtue ethics this morning, it's important to remember, first and foremost, that I am not a moral theologian nor the child of a moral theologian. And so it's very possible that since I'm not an expert in some of these things, we'll have some points for discussion about what I offer here today. But with that little caveat out of the way, as most in this gathering will know, often better than I, virtue ethics is essentially concerned with what constitutes flourishing or happiness for humans, what the Greek tradition, of course, called eudaimonia. In Proverbs, this concern, I think, has somewhat imprecisely been called success, especially in older scholarship. Along with flourishing, virtue ethics, of course, has a central place for the virtues, or the excellent qualities of character that need to be cultivated by humans in order to attain well-being. Virtue traditions thus are centrally concerned with moral agents, focusing on the ways of life of people, which are characterized either by particular vices or ideally by social or cooperative virtues, such as justice, generosity, honesty, kindness, friendship, loyalty, all of which are evident in the book of Proverbs as well, along with something like humility. Of course, to know what constitutes the flourishing of humans, one needs to know what sort of being the human is. And so virtue ethics also articulate explicitly or implicitly an anthropology or view of the human. Typically, as in Proverbs, humans are recognized not only as possessing rational capacities, but as material biological creatures and robustly social beings. These characteristics regularly entail certain natural human needs and desires. For example, for a degree of material well-being, expression of sexuality, social recognition, and the opportunity to exercise one's rational intellectual abilities in some fashion. For virtue ethics, these are goods that typically contribute to flourishing, though they are secondary to the value of virtue. It does not follow from their status as goods that things like riches or social status should be pursued by any and all means, though the mistake of many is to believe that the attainment of such things is key to happiness. The desire for and engagement with such goods needs to be guided by virtue. What's thus necessary in virtue ethics is the transformation of an agent's desire. Desire for secondary goods should not be eliminated, but trained toward a desire for wisdom or the virtues, by which one can more adequately understand both the place of secondary goods in flourishing and how they are appropriately pursued. In other words, if the virtues of wisdom's way are requisite for the authentic, successful existence of the sort of being humans are thought to be in Proverbs, the sex, honor, and riches that the book so often speaks of can be reckoned as goods that can contribute to thriving, even as the attainment of virtue or wisdom is no absolute guarantee of flourishing. Finally, what's also central to virtue ethics traditions, and I think evident in Proverbs too, is a conception of a full wisdom, or what can be called practical wisdom, what the Greek tradition calls phronesis. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, is a kind of meta-virtue that, as Julia Anna says, underlies and unifies all the virtues in the agent's practical thinking. It entails, in C.B.C. Reeves' words, a complex array of well-entrenched and stable capacities to be richly aware and effectively responsive to all the good and bad things salient in any situation, and all the considerations bearing on them. Of course, the linking in virtue ethics of a conception of human flourishing to ideas about the sort of being humans are is to make a naturalistic claim. It's to be reminded, almost inevitably, of Aristotle's infamous exclusions and hierarchies, whereby the human, or the most fully human, is reckoned as a free male citizen of the Greek polis, and the best of these is what he calls the megalosupros, or magnanimous man. Consequently, for Aristotle, the possibility of full flourishing and the virtues needed for eudaimonia revolve around this very particular sort of human, who in the late 20th century critical idiom of Audre Lorde might be regarded as Aristotle's mythical norm. Now, contemporary elaborators of the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics, like Nussbaum and McIntyre, again, those most influential biblical critics, have, of course, striven to move beyond Aristotle's natural philosophy by focusing and grounding their virtue ethics differently and less exclusively. The ancient sages of Proverbs, however, are not contemporary thinkers, and the implicit view of the human in the book, the one who might potentially fully flourish through the instruction it offers, though not identical to Aristotle's mythical norm, seems not terribly distant from it either. According to the prologue of Proverbs in chapter 1, the book is addressed to both male youths, the young and simple of verse 4, and to more advanced male students, the wise and discerning in verse 5. And those males who most likely would have been involved in ancient education, perhaps by engaging in early Proverbs scroll, as David Carr has intended, were surely of a somewhat elevated social economic status, though not necessarily exclusively the political and economic elite. It seems clear then that the attainment of wisdom and the possibility of flourishing in Proverbs is tethered firmly to ancient patriarchal males. It's thus a remarkable feature of Proverbs that the wisdom presented to the book's primary imagined male audience is figured robustly as a woman, most obviously in Proverbs 1-9, where wisdom or the virtues of the way of wisdom are personified as a woman. This feature of the book, of course, can be explained in terms of androcentric and patriarchal logic. For instance, the book's assumption that its addressees desire women sexually, and that women's sexuality needs to be controlled. The book's moral metaphor of the two ways plays an important role here too. Indeed, Proverbs 1-9 is quite simply presents the book's addressees with a choice. They might choose the wrong way of adultery with a strange or foreign woman who, like woman folly, with whom she can be identified, is depicted in terms of desirable but dangerous female sexuality that's expressed illegitimately outside the control of the patriarchal household and patriarchal marriage, as the lines on the slide, I think, suggest. Or the addressee might pursue his own potentially real wife and personified wisdom, whom many scholars believe is also presented as a desirable wife in erotic terms. Again, as the lines on the screen, I believe, suggest. On this path, however, the woman's sexuality is under control, expressed within the confines of the patriarchal household and patriarchal marriage. Now, in turning more directly to Proverbs 10-31, one can note in the history of scholarship that despite its eulogizing of a prominent female figure, the poem to the Eshechad is the source of divided opinion among feminist readers, as Alice Ogden Bellis has noted. On the one hand, some scholars argue that this image of the Eshechad is positive, offering a picture of a woman who is flourishing, making a good life for herself and her family, as Juliana Clausen has noted. The woman is, as Carol Myers contends, portrayed as an efficient and successful household manager, exhibiting resourcefulness and acumen in economic success. She, in other words, can be said to break some stereotypes of women in the Hebrew Bible as passive or not fulfilling a viable economic function. On the other hand, as Christine Yoder has noted, one might also suspect that Proverbs' final female figure represents yet another unrealistic and dehumanizing depiction of women created to entice and promote the values of men. Now, often discussions of the book's final female figure center on whether she should be regarded as depicting a real woman whom the book's addressees should seek to marry, an ancient patriarchal fantasy of the ideal wife, or a symbolic representation of woman wisdom herself. It may be that the literary presentation of the woman entails something of all three possibilities. Today, however, I want to focus in particular on how the poem's description of the woman evokes the figure of woman wisdom. Now, various connections between the two figures are fairly obvious. For example, as has often been pointed out, both woman wisdom and the woman of valor are described as better than or more precious than corals or jewels. And here, in the last line of Proverbs, the Eshechad laughs at what is to come, just as woman wisdom in the book's initial lines laughs at the calamity to come upon those who ignore her. The Eshechad also embodies many of wisdom's virtues articulated earlier in the book. She's depicted as trustworthy, diligent, and industrious, discerning in her dealings, generous to the poor, and her speech is characterized by wisdom and chesed. As Tikva farmer Kensi has written, the woman of Proverbs 10-31 seems the very personification of earthly practical wisdom. It suggests that the Eshet Chayil, as a figure who exhibits many of wisdom's virtues, and indeed evokes woman wisdom herself, can be said to constitute a kind of literary moral exemplar for the book's addressees. For virtue ethics, the role of moral exemplars is key. They are those people who in real life or story illustrate for others the dispositions and practical action. The longings of male readers of the poem are thus directed toward the Eshet Chayil, not merely because she is the kind of real or idealized woman they should want to marry. The male addressees are also to desire for themselves the very virtues that she, like desire of woman wisdom, embodies. Now, what's ironic in this scenario is the fact that although wisdom is personified as a woman, and the woman of valor is likewise a female embodiment of virtue, and so a moral exemplar for men, wisdom in Proverbs and the well-being it makes possible remains something males, especially of a certain social stratum, primarily can and ought to acquire. The poem, in other words, points up the fact that Proverbs wise men should, in a queer sort of way, be most like the virtuous women the book valorizes. And if wisdom's virtues are so strongly associated with the feminine, one might consequently think that those who attain Proverbs' wisdom are likewise associated with the feminine. This situation constitutes, in literary critical terms, an aporia, a kind of inherent contradiction in a text that here serves, at least potentially, to undermine the book's otherwise predominant association of the attainment of wisdom with patriarchal manners. It opens up, in other words, a literary interpretive space in the virtue-oriented moral tradition that Proverbs represents, where an account of the human and of human flourishing, including the virtues requisite for well-being, can be divorced from the way the book so clearly links the attainment of wisdom, though the possibility of thriving, to humans whose bodies are sexed and gendered as male. The text, however, struggles against this, and the passage takes rhetorical steps to undo the feminization of men who, like the Eshet Chayil, are or strive to be embodiments of wisdom. To counter the rhetorical feminizing of the book's male addressees, the result of an insistence that men pursued virtue that's prominently figured by the feminine. Much of the poem draws on what might be called a rhetoric of culturally exalted or hegemonic masculinity, especially a rhetoric of male warrior strength and aggression. As has long been discussed, in the Bible, the term chayil basically means strength, whether in wealth, physical power, military might, practical competencies, or character, as Michael Fox has noted. Still, the term belongs prominently to a discourse of warring warriors. Typically, in most societies, the vocation of the warrior is a decidedly male pursuit, and this was surely the case in ancient Israel. As Mark Smith explains, despite the paradigmatic presence of goddesses in warfare in ancient West Asia, the cultural expectation in this milieu remained that human females generally are not part of combat. The coloring that a militaristic term like chayil leaves on the description of a woman in Proverbs 31 is thus a striking bit of cultural rhetoric, and it's amplified throughout the passage. In verse 29, for example, chayil is deployed in the phrase asu chayil, an idiom that, as Al Walters noted, regularly means to do valiantly in a military context. In the same verse, the words ali al also deploy an idiom that is often elsewhere used. That is also used sorry about this. Well, we'll leave it there for now. That's also used in a sense of going out to do battle against an enemy. What's more, though Proverbs speaks of a woman who is valorous, in 17 of the 23 times chayil is deployed in the Bible with the opposite term, man, ish, it's in a military context. It's also the case that on a number of occasions, forms of ish chayil are associated with the terminology gibor, while forms of the expression gibor chayil in military contexts are common. As a result, Walters argued that the Eshet Chayil probably should be understood as the female counterpart of the Gibor, the title given to the mighty men of valor, which are often named in David's age. Now, besides Chal, the poem to the woman of valor makes use of a further terminology that either carries militaristic connotations or constitutes a rhetoric of strength or aggression regularly associated with men. Right at the outset of the poem, in verse 11, for example, there's an allusion to the wealth the woman secures for her husband. She says, he will have no lack of gain. The term deployed, however, is not hone or osher, words for riches that are common in Proverbs. Instead, it's shalal, a term at home in militaristic and violent contexts. It's the booty that victors in battle, the strong, the mighty, the proud, lay claim to and divide among themselves. In Proverbs 1:14, shalal is the sort of literal precious wealth, or home yakar, that constitutes the payoff the sinners promised the book's young addressees, if he will only follow their way of murderous robbery. In Proverbs 31:15, we read as well that the woman provides her household with terah, a Hebrew term which most basically means pray. Here it may simply serve as a poetic synonym for the bread or food, the lechem, mentioned at the end of the previous verse. However, the word can also be used figuratively to describe robbed or plundered goods. Consequently, as Fox has contended, in the poem to the woman of valor, the woman's acquiring of food might carry connotations of aggression and pugnacity. Still other rhetoric in the poem to the Eshet Chayil carries connotations of male strength, aggression, or military prowess. Verse 19, for example, includes reference to a dissect and spindle. The rhetoric of the line's first clause obviously describes the woman's activities in producing textiles. However, as Walters again noted, the Hebrew expression yadecha shelcha b'kishor reflects an idiom that has an aggressive connotation elsewhere, so that its use in this peaceful context is exceptional. Most intriguingly, a similar expression, but with the preposition lamed instead of bait, is deployed to recount another woman's shrewd but violent exploits in the militaristic context. In the Song of Deborah, in Judges 5:26, the same rhetoric describes Jael's grasping of the tent peg with which she kills Sisera. Elsewhere in the poem to the Eshet Chayil, the woman is also said to gird her loins with strength and to strengthen her arms. Both phases resonate with the description of male strength and martial exploits elsewhere. As Bella says, they describe the woman in military terms. Finally, in verse 25, the Eshet Chayil is further described as clothed in strength and honor, language that on occasion can be applied to the Bible's powerful male warrior deity, as in Psalm 96:6. For Walters, then, the poem's rhetoric, along with what he regards as the text's affinities to the hymn form, suggests that Proverbs 31:10-31 constitutes an heroic hymn. Indeed, for Walters, it likely reflects the development of an earlier heroic tradition in Israel or its environment, which is largely lost but still partially preserved, for example, in the Song of Deborah, an archaic poem that Smith has also connected with an Israelite heroic tradition. For Walters, the poem to the Eshet Chayil is thus well described as a species of heroic poetry, which typically describes the exploits of men belonging to an aristocratic class, a class in which honor and individual initiative rank high on the scale of values. Now, I think I still remain agnostic as to whether the poem to the Eshet Chayil is a text composed in an ancient heroic hymn form or not. But for now, I'll provisionally accept the proposal, noting simply that the text employs significant images of a culturally hegemonic masculinity to portray the woman of the poem. But to what end? What's the rhetorical effect or point of all the images of hegemonic masculinity, of warrior prowess, strength, and aggression applied to the woman? Of course, one might contend simply that such rhetoric serves only to robustly characterize the woman's strength, not only the literal strength she exhibits in her endeavors, for example, in weaving or rising early, but also the strength of her abilities in managing a complex household and the strength of her character that's revealed by the virtues she exhibits in her activities. The poem's strength language certainly could be said to have this effect, and there's no need to quarrel with that sort of interpretation of the passage, except to suggest that it stops short in two ways. On the one hand, just as it's certain that the rhetoric of strength serves to characterize the abilities of the woman as formidable, her wealth as significant, and her moral fortitude as considerable, so it also serves to color her not merely as a wife of noble character, as the NIV calls her, but also as a woman characterized by manly virtues. Septuagint Proverbs recognize something of this when it rendered Asher Kyle as Kunai Dre. On the other hand, the hegemonic masculine images and rhetoric of the text should also be integrated into an understanding of the larger dynamics of the book noted earlier, namely the fact that males to whom this poem and the entire book is primarily addressed are asked to acquire a wisdom that the book so thoroughly associates with exemplary figures, exemplary female figures. Although time doesn't permit engaging all of Walter's conclusions regarding the poem to the Asian Kyle, for him the poem finally represents an emerging reevaluation of military prowess. And here Walters draws on Richard Marx's study of the interpretation of the ideal of heroic prowess in rabbinic literature. As Walters explains, Marx suggested that the rabbinic response to the Gibborim of Israel's heroic age in part functioned to redefine Gibborim so that its associated glory applied to academic and moral victories. The poem to the Eshet Chayil is an early variant of this resignification process. Walters more or less leaves his discussion of the revaluation of military prowess in Proverbs 31 at that. He doesn't elaborate on the function of the poem and its culturally hegemonic masculine images applied to a woman within the broader literary context of the book itself. So how then should the subordination of heroic virtue to intellectual and moral excellence, which the poem seems to gesture toward, be reckoned with in the larger book of Proverbs? Well, one answer is to suggest that the tensions and incongruities related to cultural expectations of gender, warrior strength, and virtue or wisdom in the poem constitutes symptoms of the workings of what Frederick Jameson has called a text's political unconscious. On Jameson's terms, a poem like Proverbs 31, 10-31 can be said to constitute a socially symbolic act, offering a symbolic resolution of what was for the text's composers a real but intractable social contradiction or anomaly. Although placing the poem to the Eshet Chayil in the Persian period is reasonable, identifying a precise social historical context for the text is difficult. But this ultimately is not prohibited for an exploration of a text's political unconscious. As a Marxist literary critic, Jameson is, of course, deeply concerned with the relationship of texts to history, but he insists that such relations are more complex than many imagine. Indeed, he's not so much interested in, quote, the traditional notion of context familiar in older social or historical criticism, end quote. The work of uncovering that sort of background for him constitutes preliminary analysis at best. Instead, for Jameson, identifying the political unconscious of a text involves, as Barbara Foley explains, recognizing the way a literary work symptomatically registers extra-literary situations and conflicts. Interpretation concerned with articulating a text's political unconscious should thus be understood, as Jameson says, as a kind of rewriting of the literary text in such a way that the latter, that is the text, may itself be seen as the rewriting or restructuration of a prior historical or ideological subtext, it being always understood that that subtext is not immediately present as such, not some common sense external reality, but rather must itself always be reconstructed after the fact. All right, now that's a theoretical mouthful, so let me read it again. A text's political unconscious should be understood as a kind of rewriting of the literary text in such a way that the latter, that is the text, may itself be seen as the rewriting or restructuration of a prior historical or ideological subtext, it being always understood that that subtext is not immediately present as such, not some common sense external reality, but rather must itself always be reconstructed after the fact. For Jameson, then, a text takes shape as an ensemble of elements that each at once acknowledge and obscure their origins in the real, material context of class struggle and their accompanying modes of oppression and domination. It's especially, but not only via its anomalous formal maneuvers, or its anomalous formal maneuvers, that a text, as fully again explained, sutures over unresolvable historical contradictions in the world beyond the text. We've already begun to see contradictory and anomalous elements of the poem to the Aesopile that might be regarded as symptomatic of this text's political unconscious. Most fundamentally, one might expect a heroic poem, a heroic hymn to celebrate the exploits of a male warrior in battle. But the poem in Proverbs 31 and the 31 instead extols the virtues of a woman in a domestic context. What's more, despite the poem's artistic celebration of her virtues, Proverbs' assumption that particular kind of men constitute the most fully human, and so alone are in a position to fully flourish, the woman's sex and gender means that she can never attain the sort of full social recognition that contributes to the thriving that a male heroic warrior or a man of virtue might reach, and which her husband will possess her, the Baal in verse 23, in fact seems to enjoy in the city gates and among the elders. Although the woman is declared happy by her children in verse 28, and so may be flourishing as much as any woman for Proverbs might, the poem makes clear that the woman's virtue is praised primarily because it contributes to her husband's happiness. She does him good, not harm. Now, the alphabetic acrostic shape of the poem, because it's the only instance of that literary technique in Proverbs, is a further noteworthy, anomalous formal feature of the book. The acrostic here is intended, as commentators typically suggest, to literarily underscore the fullness of the woman's wisdom. As Roland Murphy contended, in moving from A to Z, or we might say Aleph to Tov, the poem bespeaks the totality and perfection of the character of the woman. Like the warrior's glory in battle, wisdom for Proverbs is something that normally men of a certain social position are in the position to pursue and embody fully. Yet in Proverbs' final lines, the acrostic structure of the text, its form, underscores the fact that it is a woman who, reminiscent of woman wisdom herself, completely expresses the virtuous character. But if the just mentioned sorts of contradictions and anomalies in the form and content of the poem to the Aesopile can be read as symptoms of the text's political unconscious, what are they symptoms of? How might one begin to describe the intractable social contradiction that the text strives to resolve symbolically? What's the prior historical or ideological subtext that the text rewrites? My suggestion is that the real and unresolvable incongruities of social life that the passage's formal maneuvers and tensions regarding strength, gender, and virtue are registering is the fact that the lives of the wise and just male composers of the poem, probably in the Persian period, is not what they believed it should be. The life of wisdom, characterized especially by the cooperative moral social virtues, which a virtue ethics reading of the book suggests is requisite for genuine flourishing, is not, as far as the composers of the poem were concerned, sufficiently accompanied by secondary goods like status or material well-being, some level of enjoyment of which is also necessary for flourishing. Instead, other men, unvirtuous or vicious people, regularly enjoy material riches and honor or social power. If a proverb like 12:21 is true, no harm happens to the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. one can imagine the composers of the text wondering, where's the evidence for it? Or if the house of the wicked is destroyed, but the tent of the upright flourishes, as 14:11 says, where's the evidence for that? The literary portrayal of the Eshekal in terms of a rhetoric of hegemonic masculinity or warrior strength and aggression thus constitutes, albeit at the level of symbolic discourse or the political unconscious of the work, a claim to status and power by one group of men vis-a-vis other men of greater social economic worth. If vicious men, in seeking their own advantage, may be willing, like real men, to subject others, even unjustly, to their physical, economic, and social strength and aggression, to their hide, if you will, the men who embrace the socially cooperative virtues that are figured by the feminine ought not to be, as women in various cultural contexts regularly have been, socially subordinated to or dominated by such men. The wise, too, are strong, warrior-like, or manly. Their strength, however, lies not in their literal physical might, economic accumulation, or social power, but in their ways of life, which eschew violence, unbridled striving for wealth, and socially disruptive, agonistic pursuits of political and social advantage, modes of conduct that Proverbs elsewhere relegates to the ways of wicked and foolish men. For example, the rich man, certainly a figure of social and economic strength in Proverbs, is never portrayed positively in the book, despite his possession of a good like riches. And in fact, he's typically figured negatively. Indeed, the term ashir in the book points not simply to an economic identity, one who possesses much wealth, it's also a negative moral type. The rich man in Proverbs wrongly trusts his wealth, or trusts in his wealth, as Proverbs 18:10 and 11 together suggest. He's proud or wise in his own eyes, as 28:11 declares. And because the rich man lacks virtue, he also typically lords it over others, as 18:23 and probably 22:7 intimate. In fact, the ashir can be collocated with the person who oppresses the poor, as 22:2 and 29:13 together reveal. But as 14:31 says, for Proverbs, those who oppress the poor insult their maker, and those who are kind to the needy insult their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him. Indeed, despite an ashir's possession of a secondary good like wealth, for Proverbs, it's better to be poor and walk in integrity than to be crooked in one's way, even though rich. What's more, we already saw that in Proverbs 1, others who pursued a good like riches by murderous violence were called in the masculine for khatim, sinners. Proverbs 11:16 similarly says that ruthless men, ruthless or terrifying, are at zine, grasp for riches, in contrast to a woman of grace who grasps for honor. And if it's by justice that a king gives civility to a man, and ish teremoth, a man of extractions, ruins it, as 29:4 makes clear. Proverbs even knows of the ish machid, a man of destruction, who in 28:24 robs father and mother and shamelessly claims, ain't pesha, it's not a crime. Throughout Proverbs, wicked men who in striving for various goods or advantage are associated with arrogance, greed, crooked speech, violence, injustice, a lack of mercy, and so forth. So now, on to some conclusions. If in the poem to the Eshekal, one can glimpse a bit of the unraveling of the tight connection Proverbs assumes between attainment of wisdom or virtue and patriarchal maleness, which itself indirectly points to a real social incongruity in the world of its composer, what should be next said about virtue ethics in Proverbs? Well, many things, of that I'm sure, but I offer only a few concluding remarks. First, as a mere snapshot of an ancient moral tradition, the book of Proverbs in the form we have it is, of course, a deeply conserving text. And despite some perhaps valuable ethical perspectives that a virtue ethics lens might reveal and mine from the book, such as the priority it places on cooperative virtues, It's easy to identify objections to this ancient moral discourse. For example, its ultimate inability to decouple the attainment of wisdom and full flourishing from a version of patriarchal moments. Now, although I don't wish to unduly conflate virtue ethics with contemporary ethical communitarianism, a statement regarding the latter by feminist scholar Penny Weiss is apt when thinking about Proverbs as a virtue-oriented moral discourse. She says, it seems that whatever the extent to which communitarian theorists might be said to be egalitarian, inegalitarian threads also connect. Threads that variously throughout history define women out of certain communities, downplay the negative effects of women's domestication, exclude women in conceptions and calculations of the common good, refuse to address sexual differentiation and inequality as obstacles to personal and political bonds, and advocate patriarchal principles, values, and structures to guide their communities. Now, however true as such a statement is, Proverbs should not, I think, be reckoned as only conserving or as exclusively venerating sometimes problematic moral perspectives of past communities. As a virtue-oriented moral discourse, the book, I think, also participates in the sort of moral tradition that's fundamentally open to revision and innovation. We can, for instance, recall that for virtue traditions, practical wisdom is a central virtue. As Nussbaum says of phronesis, the person of practical wisdom must be prepared to meet the new with responsiveness and imagination, cultivating the sort of flexibility and perceptiveness that will permit one to improvise what's required. What's more, and perhaps more apt, for Aristotle, learning virtue was analogous to the learning and exercise of a skill, such as playing a harp. MacIntyre develops this idea with his notion of practices, complex human undertakings, like chess or playing jazz, where those who are expert in a practice and devoted to the activities, values, and virtues integral to it are sometimes well justified in modifying the traditions of that practice, the way it's organized and carried out. If the virtue-oriented moral tradition that Proverbs represents might be reckoned as a moral practice in MacIntyre's sense, practical moral reasoners today who may wish to engage the book's ethical program in relation to their own moral theological work should not be content with the reification of its instruction and simply valorize or reject its ancient perspectives. They should continue the traditioning work and alongside the biblical text, engage constructively other discourses of knowledge, whether the insights of the natural and social sciences and philosophy, or the moral discourses, demands, and epistemologies of different ethical traditions. Indeed, as Annis has explained for the Aristotelian tradition, the virtuous person may well, as a result of developing virtue, revise or reject some of the initial judgments she accepted when learning to be virtuous. And as we saw, Proverbs insists that its teaching was not only for the young and simple, it was for the wise and understanding too. Those who have learned instruction well, perhaps, those who have learned instruction well, perhaps at times edited and added to the book's collection and furthered that ancient moral tradition, whether by drawing on their own insights and experiences, engaging a folk wisdom preserved by broader communities in Israel and Judah, or by adapting the teachings from further afield, whether Egypt, as in Proverbs 22:17 to 23:11, or perhaps Massa, depending on how one understands the initial lines of Proverbs 30 and 31. Now, if time permitted, we might explore a bit MacIntyre's revision of the nature of the human in the Aristotelian tradition that he elaborates as just one example of the sort of constructive engagement with an ancient virtue tradition like Proverbs that's possible. And just very briefly, in Dependent Rational Animals, for MacIntyre, humans are understood to be profoundly dependent and vulnerable beings or animals who need particular virtues in order to flourish, what he calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence. Well, for McIntyre, the virtues of acknowledged dependence would include things like misericordia, right, pity, or the ability to view and make as one's own the distress of another person, and then act to alleviate it. But for McIntyre, it's not just simply the virtues of giving that are parts of his virtues of acknowledged dependence. The virtues of receiving must be cultivated as well for the sort of vulnerable, dependent animal that humans are. So he writes, to the virtues of giving must be added virtues of receiving. Such virtues as those of knowing how to exhibit gratitude without allowing that gratitude to be a burden, courtesy towards the graceless giver, and forbearance towards the inadequate giver. The exercise of these latter virtues always involves a truthful acknowledgement of dependence, and they are therefore virtues bound to be lacking in those whose forgetfulness of their dependence is expressed in an unwillingness to remember benefits conferred by others. One outstanding example, even perhaps the outstanding example of this type of bad character, and also of a failure to recognize its badness, is Aristotle's negative sucrose. Now, we'll have to leave McIntyre at that because our time is running out. And so I will simply end with the observation that perhaps like Bezalel, right, who was a Hakam lady, a skilled artisan, who was called to employ his creativity to devise artistic design in the work of tabernacle construction, the building of his community's sacred space. So a text like Proverbs might be said to invite individuals in community who engage in virtue-oriented discourse to cultivate a moral imagination that strives more fully to understand humans in all their diversity, and thereby discover and devise ways for more people and other parts of the divine's creation, to flourish more and in more ways. Thank you. As I understand it, we have a little time for questions or observations or suggestions. And so the floor is open. And there's a mic that's coming around, I believe, if anyone has a question or a comment.
Thank you very much for this insightful and interesting paper. I have one question concerning actually this basic observation that the Isha Chayil is presented in terms of a male warrior, as I would read the text rather with regard, you see, Saraf basically usually relates to a predating animal, predator. And Shalal seems to me more refers to the man in the passage than actually to the woman. And so I have always understood this as the woman being compared or represented in the image of a lioness, because the lioness is the one who gets the food for her family, and so that's how I have always read this passage, and maybe I would like you to discuss this alternative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's certainly certainly in the commentaries. I think I even just reviewed one a couple nights ago. The woman, especially around the language of terror, right? Because of its connotations with animal prey, would suggest a woman is a lioness, right? That actual term comes up a lot. It's repeated a lot in the commentaries, right? So, I think my argument doesn't rest on sort of just one term, right? Fox, I was following Fox here around his discussion of terror, where he was pointing to at least a couple of texts where its usage seemed to be more figuratively applied to creatures that are not animals that killing their prey. So I was following that, but I think sort of the larger sense is that there's a cluster of these images, right? That in a sense suggests the woman is being portrayed as at least in the rhetoric of this kind of cultural hegemonic masculinity that I was talking about. Now, it's not necessarily obvious, and I will concede that perhaps you got to want it a little bit, right? But it really is the sort of the cluster. Kyle is kind of the kicking off point, right? With its clear connotation, the warrior cultures, right? And then all the other things together sort of bring that. But yeah, certainly that's the lion's interpretation is very common in the commentary tradition. Thank you.
Thank you for your paper very much. I ended up teaching this text quite a bit, and so your talk has given me a lot of resources for taking in the classroom the next time. I was wondering, how would you relate your reading of the poem to the verses that preceded, verses 1 through 9, that have those lecture connections? Is it reacting against those verses, or just what's your kind of take on that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as sort of a scholar who's sort of trained in in sort of traditional methods, my mind almost automatically works that 1 to 9 is kind of a separate, independent poetic collection, and 10 to 31 is its own thing, right? But my students persistently remind me that, hey, the whole chapter is about the woman, right? And so they want to connect the Ancient Kyle with Lemuel's mother earlier in the chapter, right? So, or the woman earlier in the chapter. They read the whole thing together, right? So I don't have at this point a response to that. I haven't quite gotten there, but I need to, because my students will also sort of raise that point. I guess sort of behind all that, my answer is that I see it as it's an independent poem that was probably constructed to sort of cap off the book, right? It was the last thing added to the book. I'm guessing probably in the Persian period. So yes, I do a lot of reading the text as a whole, right? But at least in this instance, I'm imagining sort of the text being the last thing produced, almost as a response to the rest of the book, right? Almost as kind of representing an early, maybe not the first, but a very early sort of response to the Book of Proverbs, right? Like sometimes folks would, maybe analogous to the way folks would sometimes think of the Elihu speeches as kind of response to the Job material. So thank you, appreciate that.
This might be tangential, but Aristotle, is Greek, and you're sort of, so you've not into the Greek world. But I think the way Penelope is portrayed in the Odyssey is an interesting way where you have these gender roles kind of, it's a warrior culture, it's a royal culture, but she is adopting these kinds of things. The metaphor Homer uses at the very end says that she's like a shipwrecked sailor. There's really some rich material, and I wonder if, and obviously you've got something focused that's kind of moving forward. I don't want to just divert you, but Homer, the way Penelope is the figure in ancient Mediterranean literature, I think that closely dovetails with this interesting kind of spectrum of gender kind of imagery that we were talking about in Proverbs 31. There's great feminist work done on the Odyssey, obviously, in Emily Wilson's translation. It's first rate as well.
Oh, great, thank you, I appreciate that. I'll definitely check that out as I sort of continue some work on Proverbs, maybe not immediately, but in the future. Yeah, so I think that's really helpful, right? Because others, Bernhard Lang, for example, has pointed to, is it Xenophon? Is the economist, right? That little work as also sort of potentially being sort of a key sort of comparative text as well. And of course, sort of the personification of virtue and vice as women, right, in patriarchal cultures, it's also pretty well done, right? Heracles, that famous incident with Heracles, for example. So yeah, there's a whole host of it, and I'm happy to cast that net broadly, right? Because I sort of see the sort of the cultural continuum to be that sort of Mediterranean based. So thank you, appreciate that. I'll definitely follow up on this.
Thank you so much for your presentation, your paper. I was just wondering, when you had pointed out about the spindle and about the nature of like the warrior aspect of what precedes in the first line. The question is like, so it made me think of the plows turned into, I mean, the swords turned into plows or like shears. So would you see it specifically about the woman, or is it a call to domesticity in that same kind of way? I mean, so even though it's a different genre of, so in wisdom literature, is it pointing to a time of peace rather than to a time of war in the same way as the prophetic literature?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and really interesting observation. Yeah, I'm not sure, right? I mean, I think sort of on the sort of the surface, straightforward level reading, yes, it's an image of domesticity and peace, right? It's not about aggression or violence, right? But you know, when one starts to scratch the surface, right, it at least has the language, at least the rhetoric, at least has those connotations in Judges 5, right? And so it kind of works at both levels, right? It's at two levels, right? Because remember, we're talking about the political unconscious, right? How these images, right, that you know, in a sense, are being used almost unconsciously, sort of suggest that there may have been a real sort of social incongruity that was being resolved here, right? So yes and yes, right, and no, I would say at the same time. So thank you. That's really interesting, and I want to think about that a little bit more. I'm a little unsatisfied with that response to this.
Thank you. Thanks for the response and thanks for your paper. Again, let's give another round of applause.